Many wars in human history have been started without a good reason. For the most part, those reasons were things like an increase in power or the growth of a nation. However, also things like a thrown chair or a city-owned bucket have been the ignition for a year-long brutally fought battle before. Therefore, it shouldn't come as a surprise to hear that possibly the dumbest reason a war was ever started was because a guy laughed too hard at a mistake of his friend. Thinking about all the people who died in those wars can be quite depressing, which is why today we'll be looking at a war in which the only casualties were money, status, and already dead animals. The Bone Wars were not only a 15-year-long lasting conflict, but they were also fought between only two individuals, Old Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Before I get to explaining the Bone Wars itself, I first need to introduce our two competitors. Marsh was a studied geologist and originally born into a poor family. However, his rich uncle Peabody took a liking to him and made sure to use his wealth to buy his beloved nephew lots of cool things. For example, did Peabody finance the building of an entire museum, which he then gifted to a university under the condition that they would employ Marsh as a professor. Now, as it turns out, Marsh, while not having a clue about animals, less so dinosaurs, really wanted to be a paleontologist. So naturally, he used his sugar uncle's money to do the only rational thing. He paid a lot of capable and smart paleontologists to do the research under his name and forbid them to publish anything without naming Marsh himself as the author. Needless to say that this strategy, together with his egocentric and arrogant personality, made him little to no friends in the field of paleontology, and even had a lot of his former employees become his sworn enemies later in life. Cope, on the other hand, was in fact a studied paleontologist, and he was privately tutored by one of the most well-known names in the game, Joseph Leidy, a well-respected man who made the first dinosaur skeleton discovery in North America. Cope was, unlike Marsh, very knowledgeable in the field of paleontology and even got to be the professor of paleontology at the University of Harvard for 4 years, before eventually giving up on his employment to concentrate on his research full-time. Depending on which sources you believe, Cope was either a relatively nice guy and easy to befriend, or a rather uncomfortable, short-tempered ass who was hard to work with. I personally find the latter more likely, for reasons that will become abundantly obvious soon enough. The two of them first met at a science conference in Germany in the early 1860s, where they seemed to become good friends and even went far enough to name their findings after the respective other. This friendship broke apart very quickly due to their strong personalities. As it appears, the spark of the Bone Wars seemed to be ignited when Cope tried to reconstruct the skeleton of a dinosaur, but accidentally misplaced the head onto its tail instead of the neck. Marsh seemed to find this so hilarious that he burst out laughing, loudly making fun of his friend for a long time. Of course, Cope didn't take that kindly, coming from someone who has no real clue about dinosaurs himself, and many believe that he swore to get revenge on Marsh from this point onward. As fate will have it, around this time science also seemed to slowly expand into the field of paleontology, and the newly founded United States Geological Survey started funding research for expeditions in the Rocky Mountains. Marsh and Cope eagerly jumped to the opportunity, hoping to make big finds in this untouched part of land and therefore making their names known across science. This effectively made them rivals, since back in the day the principle was first come first serve when it came to making your findings public. And thus the Bone War started with the both of them trying to constantly undermine the other and making the next big fossil find in North America. Now, if you're still watching, you may think, well, okay, but where's the interesting part? And lucky for you, this is where the fun begins. As I said before, both of these men seem to be rather unpleasant to work with, and in their quest to outdo the other, they would hire the most skilled paleontologists and assistants for their expeditions, and also publicly shame and fire their staff if they made even the smallest of mistakes. They would also not shy back from hiring spies and send them to their rival to see what intel they could gather to use against them. Marsh seemingly also used his influence as the official vertebrate paleontologist of the USGS to selectively prevent Cope from publishing his findings. The both of them would also publicly badmouth the other and make fun of their mistakes, which the entire remaining science community seemed to find rather fucking stupid. Things like bribery were also a rather common strategy for them, used to once again undermine whatever the other one wants to publish. And at this point, I want to remind you that this whole feud is about digging up skeletons of dead animals. The Bone Wars eventually peaked when these two morons started fucking exploding their dig sites. And since telling you what happened would be rather boring, I'll just show you what I mean by that. Alright then, gentlemen, this marks the end of our expedition. we have spent the entire last summer here and made some impressive discoveries. I gotta say, I'm proud of you all. Now then, Timothy, clean up the dig site if you will.
As you wish, sir.
As insane as it may seem, this actually happened. At the height of the conflict, the two of them seriously blew up their dig sites so that the other would not be able to go there anymore and make more findings on already prepared grounds. And this wasn't a one-time occurrence either, no. They did this on multiple occasions. The value of the fossils lost in these cleanups can't possibly be estimated, but it gotta be at least a few $1 million reduce they just reduced to ashes in order to prevent their rival from digging in their dirt. In the end, Marsh eventually lost his special position in the USGS due to his annoying behavior and the abusement of his status and funds. Additionally, he spent all his money on the expeditions and was eventually left with next to nothing, making him beg to be paid by the university he was employed at. I know, beg to be paid sounds odd, but you have to keep in mind that Marsh was so arrogant and rich that he viewed payment as unnecessary. Up until he was out of money, that is. Cope also spent his entire wealth on these expeditions and had to sell his private fossil collection in order to escape financial ruin. At the end of their lives, neither of them were a respected member of the Paleontologist Society anymore, despite having collectively found nearly 150 new fossils. Sadly, due to the often rushed releases of their papers, many fossil reconstructions and descriptions have been published being littered with errors and mistakes, so that proper paleontologists had to spend years after the bone was ended just cleaning up the mess those two left behind. Alfred Romer eventually described the conclusion of the bone was with having two losing sides, as both of them lost all their money, status, and public respect as a consequence of this feud. So I think it's needless to say that this has possibly been the dumbest war in human history.